There's marrying for money, and then there's what happened when America's Gilded Age collided with Europe's Age of Decline, a systematic exchange of daughters and dowries that would reshape the aristocratic landscape of two continents. And the equation was brutally simple. European nobles possessed titles, estates, and bloodlines, stretching back to medieval battlefields, but their bank accounts had dwindled to embarrassing levels that made maintaining appearances increasingly impossible. American industrialists possessed fortunes so vast they dwarfed royal treasuries, yet found every door to genuine social power firmly closed by establishments that viewed railroad money as fundamentally inferior to inherited land. Meet the daughters, raised in Fifth Avenue mansions, educated in Paris, and ultimately deployed as financial instruments in their fathers' campaigns for respectability, exchanging their millions for coronets, while discovering that becoming a duchess often meant becoming a prisoner. Today, we investigate the women who became known as dollar princesses, exposing how their transatlantic marriages rescued Europe's crumbling estates, while revealing the personal costs of being traded like corporate assets in the marriage markets of two worlds. Picture yourself at 17, wearing a silk gown worth a kingdom, tears soaking your pillow the night before your wedding. Your mother has just threatened to have the man you actually love killed. Tomorrow, you'll marry a duke you barely know, trading your happiness for a coronet. This isn't the beginning of a Gothic novel. It's the true story of Consuelo Vanderbilt, the reluctant duchess whose journey from gilded prisoner to independent woman would rewrite the rules of society. When they called her the most beautiful debutante in America, they didn't realize they were describing a masterpiece trapped in its own frame. This is the story of how wealth beyond imagination became chains of gold, and how one woman's rebellion against the glittering cage of the Gilded Age would inspire generations. On the 2nd of March 1877, as America's Gilded Age reached its glittering zenith, Consuelo Vanderbilt entered life bearing the weight of expectations that would nearly crush her spirit. Born into America's wealthiest family, she emerged from childhood carrying both extraordinary beauty and invisible chains, a combination that would shape her destiny in ways both magnificent and tragic. Alva Vanderbilt, her mother, wielded ambition like a weapon, carving out the family's place in society with the same ruthless determination that her husband William Kissam Vanderbilt used to expand their railroad empire. Young Consuelo, blessed with a swan-like neck, luminous eyes, and an ethereal grace that turned heads wherever she went, became her mother's masterpiece in making. Every breath, every gesture, every word was sculpted according to Alva's exacting standards. The limestone mansion at 65th Avenue, where Consuelo spent her formative years, served as both palace and prison. Within its opulent walls, she endured a rigorous education that went far beyond the typical finishing school curriculum. Alva's iron will shaped every aspect of her daughter's upbringing, from deportment to discourse, moulding her into the perfect vessel for the family's social aspirations. The physical and emotional demands of this grooming paled in comparison to the psychological conditioning that accompanied it, constant reminders that the Vanderbilt name carried obligations that superseded personal happiness. As Consuelo grew, her mother's plans crystallized with frightening precision. Alva had not invested years of careful cultivation merely to see her daughter marry into American society. No, she had grander ambitions. A European title that would elevate the Vanderbilts above their nouveau riche peers. The fact that American heiresses had begun trading fortunes for coronets in what the press dubbed the dollar princess phenomenon only strengthened Alva's resolve. When Consuelo made her society debut in 1895, she set New York ablaze with speculation. Her grace and beauty made the other debutantes seem coarse by comparison. Her regal bearing seemed to presage her future role. But behind the carefully orchestrated appearances, behind the silk gowns and practiced smiles, a quiet rebellion was brewing. Consuelo had formed an attachment to a New York socialite, Winthrop Rutherford, whose lack of title made him unacceptable in Alva's calculating eyes. The summer season brought a whirlwind of social engagements, each one carefully orchestrated by Alva to position her daughter for the grand finale she had planned. As summer faded into autumn, whispers began circulating through Newport and New York about negotiations with a cash-strapped English duke. Consuelo, drowning in her mother's ambitions, found herself swept toward a fate she never chose, her own desires as irrelevant as last season's fashions. That autumn, as Manhattan's elite gathered in their Fifth Avenue mansions to trade gossip over tea, Alva Vanderbilt prepared to play her final hand in the game of social advancement. And the stakes were her daughter's heart and happiness, though such considerations seemed trivial compared to the glittering prize of a ducal coronet. Through the gilded halls of New York society, speculation mounted as November approached, each whispered conversation carrying the weight of impending transformation. In November 1895, as autumn's last leaves clung desperately to Manhattan's trees, Consuelo Vanderbilt faced the most devastating battle of her young life. Behind the magnificent doors of her family's Fifth Avenue mansion, Alva Vanderbilt orchestrated what would become known as one of the most ruthless matrimonial campaigns in American social history. The Duke of Marlborough had arrived in New York that fall, his ancient title burnished, but his coffers empty. Charles Spencer Churchill, known since childhood as Sonny, came seeking what so many of his peers sought in America, a fortune to restore his crumbling ancestral seat, Blenheim Palace. In Consuelo, he found not only extraordinary beauty and impeccable breeding, but also the vast Vanderbilt wealth that could save his estate. The young heiress's resistance to the match sparked a domestic siege that would haunt her for decades. Alva, determined to secure a duchess's coronet for her daughter, employed tactics that shocked even their jaded social circle. When Consuelo's heart turned toward Winthrop Rutherford, Alva's rage knew no bounds. She even threatened to have the young man killed. Through emotional manipulation and relentless pressure, she wore down her daughter's resistance until the inevitable surrender. On the morning of the 6th of November, 1895, New York witnessed what the press dubbed the wedding of the century. St. Thomas Church overflowed with society's elite, the cream of American and European aristocracy gathering to witness the union. Yet few among the assembled guests could see the tears that had soaked Consuelo's pillow the night before, or sense the deep despair beneath her composed exterior. As she walked down the aisle in her Worth gown, her face partially concealed by a delicate veil, Consuelo carried the weight of her mother's ruthless ambition. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of social theatre, with Bishop Henry Codman Potter officiating as the Duke awaited his American bride. The wedding breakfast that followed at the Vanderbilt mansion featured a guest list that read like a complete edition of the social register. Yet amid the champagne toasts and celebratory fanfare, the newly minted Duchess of Marlborough remained oddly silent, her thoughts perhaps dwelling on what might have been. The price of this social triumph was calculated in cold numbers: a dowry of $2.5 million in railroad stock, a staggering sum equivalent to over $75 million in today's currency. The human cost, the sacrifice of a young woman's happiness and free will, went unrecorded in the society columns that breathlessly detailed every aspect of the celebration. In the weeks that followed, as Consuelo prepared for her new life in England, Manhattan's drawing rooms buzzed with speculation about the match. Some praised Alva's brilliant manoeuvring, while others whispered about the ruthlessness of her methods. But none could deny that she had achieved her ultimate goal. Her daughter would cross the Atlantic, not as another wealthy American bride, but as her Grace, the Duchess of Marlborough. As the newlyweds departed for England, leaving behind the glimmer of New York society, autumn storms battered the Atlantic. The turbulent crossing seemed an apt metaphor for the upheaval that awaited the reluctant Duchess in her new homeland, where ancient traditions and aristocratic expectations would test the limits of her endurance. Blenheim Palace rose before Consuelo in the late autumn of 1895, its massive facade a monument to centuries of aristocratic power. The seat of the Dukes of Marlborough stood as both a triumph of English Baroque architecture and a crushing symbol of the responsibilities that now lay upon her young shoulders. The American-born Duchess found herself mistress of one of England's grandest estates, its vast rooms and endless corridors, the weight of tradition she was expected to uphold. The crisis facing Blenheim was immediate and severe. Years of neglect had left the palace in a state of elegant decay that even its magnificent architecture could no longer disguise. Water damage threatened priceless tapestries, while entire wings stood empty, their furnishings sold off by previous generations. The marriage settlement, which provided an annual income of $100,000 to the Duke and an additional $100,000 to Consuelo, would soon be put to use, funding extensive renovations that would save this architectural treasure from ruin. Yet even as she threw herself into the restoration of Blenheim, Consuelo discovered that renovating a palace was far easier than building a marriage. The Duke, while unfailingly polite, maintained an emotional distance that grew more pronounced with each passing month. Their union, founded on mutual duty rather than affection, settled into a pattern of elaborate courtesy that masked profound loneliness on both sides. Motherhood arrived with mechanical precision, as demanded by duty. The birth of their first son, John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, in 18 fulfilled the primary obligation of a duchess, providing an heir to the dukedom. A second son, Lord Ivor Spencer Churchill, followed in 1898, completing the expected heir and spare. The children brought moments of joy to Consuelo's life, but they could not fill the emotional void at the heart of her marriage. The young Duchess found her true calling in the role of social reformer. She threw herself into philanthropic works with an energy that surprised and sometimes scandalized traditional aristocratic circles. Under her direction, Blenheim became a centre for progressive social initiatives. She established programs for the estate's workers and their families, including housing improvements and educational opportunities. Her work with London's poor, particularly unwed mothers and their children, revealed a compassion that transcended class boundaries. In English society, Consuelo's beauty and natural grace made her a sensation. The American Duchess brought a fresh vitality to the often staid world of the British aristocracy, her presence at social functions drawing attention and admiration. Yet beneath the surface, success lay a growing awareness that she had traded one gilded cage for another. The Duke, meanwhile, pursued his own interests and companionship elsewhere. Their public appearances together became increasingly formal affairs, choreographed to maintain the appearance of marital harmony while masking the reality of their estrangement. The palace that had once seemed like a fairy tale setting began to feel more like an elaborate stage set for a performance neither of them believed in anymore. As the new century dawned, bringing with it winds of social change, Consuelo began to question the bargain that had brought her to Blenheim. The price of her title, her freedom, her happiness, her very sense of self seemed increasingly steep. The restoration of Blenheim was progressing, but the woman who had helped save it was quietly crumbling behind her perfect Duchess facade. In 1906, the facade finally began to crack, and the comfortable fiction of the Marlboroughs' marriage could no longer withstand the pressure of their mutual unhappiness. The Duchess, who had once been America's most celebrated bride, was about to scandalize society once again, this time by choosing her own path. The Marlboroughs' separation in 1906 marked the end of what society had once heralded as the perfect union of old-world nobility and new-world wealth. For Consuelo, now 29, the decision to separate marked the beginning of a profound personal transformation, though the legal bonds would take many more years to fully dissolve. In the aftermath of the separation, Consuelo emerged from the shadows of her imposed role to discover her own voice. No longer bound by the strict protocols of her position as Duchess of Marlborough, she threw herself into causes that reflected her true passions. Her work with the Women's Municipal Party in London revealed a keen political mind that had long been masked by her social duties. The suffragette movement found in her an eloquent advocate, her own experience of powerlessness lending authenticity to her support for women's rights. The years following the separation saw Consuelo flourish in unexpected ways. She established herself as a formidable public speaker, addressing crowds on social reform and women's suffrage. Her philanthropic work expanded, focusing particularly on improving conditions for women and children in London's most deprived areas. The woman who had once been valued primarily for her beauty and wealth proved herself a capable organiser and passionate advocate for social change. When World War I erupted in 1914, Consuelo channeled her organisational skills into vital war relief efforts. As chair of the Economic Relief Committee for the American Women's War Relief Fund, she worked tirelessly to aid those affected by the conflict. Her efforts during these years earned recognition from both the British government and international relief organisations, establishing her as a leader in humanitarian causes. Throughout these years, she maintained a dignified silence about her marriage, even as society buzzed with speculation. The Duke had his own life now, and Consuelo found herself increasingly drawn to a different future. In Jacques Balsan, a French pioneer of balloon and airplane aviation, she discovered the possibility of a love based on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than social obligation. The long path to divorce finally concluded in 1921. The legal dissolution of her marriage to the Duke of Marlborough marked not just the end of a union, but the beginning of Consuelo's true independence. The Duke would later petition for an annulment from the Anglican Church, with Consuelo's consent, a process that would reach its conclusion in 1926. The annulment would validate what she had known all along, that her consent to the marriage had never been freely given. The years between separation and divorce had transformed the once dutiful Duchess into a woman of substance and independence. Her beauty, which had once been her primary currency in society's marriage market, was now merely one aspect of a complex and accomplished personality. The skills she had developed as a young duchess were now directed toward meaningful charitable initiatives, while her experience of arranged marriage made her a powerful voice for women's autonomy. As the post-war world emerged from the ashes of conflict, Consuelo stood ready to embrace a new chapter in her life. The woman who had once walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Church in tears now faced her future with clear-eyed determination. The price of her freedom had been high, but its value was beyond measure. In 1921, at the age of 44, Consuelo Vanderbilt began her second act. Her marriage to Jacques Balsan marked not just a new union, but the triumph of personal choice over social obligation. Unlike the theatrical spectacle of her first wedding, this ceremony celebrated a genuine connection between two people who had chosen each other freely. The contrast could not have been more profound. Where the young Duchess had once walked down the aisle in tears, Consuelo Balsan now moved forward with quiet joy. The years with Jacques proved transformative. Their shared life between France and America allowed Consuelo to bridge the two worlds that had shaped her existence. At their French estate, Château Saint-Georges Motel, she created the kind of home that Blenheim, for all its grandeur, had never been. The gardens she designed there reflected her mature taste, free from the constraints of aristocratic tradition. Her relationship with her sons, John and Ivor, evolved and deepened through the years, demonstrating that maternal bonds could survive and even thrive beyond the confines of a failed marriage. The 1930s brought new challenges as Europe darkened under the shadow of fascism. When France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, the Balsans were forced to flee, leaving behind their beloved chateau. They made their way to America, where Consuelo once again demonstrated her resilience. During these years, she channeled her energy into supporting the Free French movement and various relief organizations aiding European refugees. In 1953, Consuelo published her memoir, The Glitter and the Gold. The book offered more than just a glimpse into the vanished world of the Gilded Age. It served as a thoughtful meditation on privilege, duty, and the high price of social ambition. With remarkable candour, she detailed her mother's ruthless machinations and her own journey from powerless young bride to independent woman. The memoir became a bestseller, introducing a new generation to her story. Throughout these later years, Consuelo maintained a dignified relationship with her first husband. When the Duke of Marlborough died in 1934, she penned a touching tribute to him, acknowledging their shared history while celebrating how far they both had come from their ill-fated beginning. Her own mother, Alva, had testified during the annulment proceedings, acknowledging her role in forcing her daughter into the marriage, a final confirmation of what Consuelo had always known. The woman who emerged in these decades bore little resemblance to the frightened teenage bride of 1895. Her beauty, once her primary asset in society's eyes, had matured into an elegant grace that reflected her inner development. The skills she had learned managing Blenheim found expression in her charitable work and the management of her own estates. The diplomatic abilities she had developed navigating aristocratic society served her well in her humanitarian efforts. The loss of her son Ivor in 1956 marked a profound personal tragedy in her later years. Yet Consuelo maintained her strength and dignity, continuing her charitable work and maintaining close ties with her remaining family. She had learned long ago that life's greatest challenges often led to unexpected forms of growth. Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan died on the 6th of December 1964 in Southampton, Long Island. She was 87 years old and had lived to see the world of her youth, with its rigid social hierarchies and arranged marriages, fade into history. Her legacy lived on not in titles or coronets, but in the example she set of a woman who had found the courage to chart her own course. In the end, her story transcended the familiar narrative of an American heiress trading wealth for a title. Instead, it became something far more compelling. The journey of a woman who had transformed a gilded cage into a launching pad for a life of substance and meaning. The reluctant Duchess had become, at last, simply herself. You're holding a newspaper from 1895 with the headline blaring, "It will cost her $160,000 to wed the imported French count." It sounds steep until you realise that was just the wedding. The real price? $10 million and 11 years of systematic humiliation. You're reading about Anna Gould, a woman so rich she could afford the most expensive romantic mistake in American history, and so plain that newspapers joked she was especially beautiful when seen through her dowry. Her husband would use her fortune to build a replica of Versailles in Paris, all while carrying on affairs with both men and women, scandals so outrageous they shocked even sophisticated European society, proving that some imports come with hidden costs that never stop accumulating. This tale of transatlantic marriage gone wrong reveals how even America's greatest fortunes could be wrecked by a single charming European with exquisite taste and slippery morals. Therefore, in today's episode of Old Money Allure, we explore how a French count's expensive appetites nearly destroyed one of the grandest inherited fortunes in American history. Anna Gould was living proof that in the Gilded Age, being spectacularly ugly didn't matter if you were spectacularly rich, and she was both in equal measure. Born on June 5, 1875, Anna was the daughter of Jay Gould, one of America's most notorious robber barons, who was widely considered the most hated man in late 19th century America. Jay Gould had built his $70 million fortune through methods that would make modern corporate villains blush, bribing legislators, manipulating railroad stocks, attempting to corner the gold market, and triggering financial panics that ruined countless investors. When he died in 1892, Anna inherited a staggering $15 million trust fund that provided her with an annual income of $500,000, making her one of the richest women in America despite being universally acknowledged as one of the least attractive. Contemporary observers were brutally honest about Anna's appearance, describing her as short, sallow, self-obsessed, and possessing what one account delicately called a simian face and a sullen disposition. American playwright Natalie Clifford Barney was even more savage, calling Anna the most unwashed and dirty-looking creature I ever laid eyes on, which was quite an insult coming from someone in the theatre world. The French press? with their unmatched talent for cutting wit, famously quipped that Anna was especially beautiful when seen through her dowry, a line that perfectly captured how everyone viewed this walking dollar sign. Raised in the luxury that only robber baron money could provide, Anna developed her father's strong sense of self and complete indifference to public opinion, traits that would serve her well in the battles ahead. But Anna's physical shortcomings were about to become irrelevant when she encountered the most dangerous type of European aristocrat, a devastatingly handsome, completely broke French count with expensive taste and flexible morals. Enter Paul Ernest Boniface de Castellane, known as Bonnie, a penniless but gorgeous French nobleman who could trace his lineage back to the 11th century and his debts back to last week. Born in 1867, Bonnie was everything Anna wasn't: breathtakingly handsome, effortlessly charming, and possessed of the kind of impeccable taste that could make spending other people's money look like high art. He was also desperately poor, his ancient family's wealth having long since evaporated, leaving him with nothing but his title, his looks, and an absolutely ruthless determination to marry rich. Boney arrived in New York in 1894 with a singular mission that he didn't bother hiding: to bag himself an heiress through what he conducted like a military campaign, disguised as a romantic courtship. Anna and Bonnie met in 1894 at a Paris social event, hosted by Fanny Reed, a friend of the Gould family, where Anna was supposed to be safely engaged to financier Oliver Harriman. But Anna, then 19, was immediately captivated by Bonnie's charm and noble title, abandoning her practical engagement for the promise of European aristocracy. Boney, 28 and calculating, saw Anna's fortune as the answer to his financial woes and conducted his pursuit with the efficiency of a businessman closing a deal. The French Count was refreshingly transparent about his fortune-hunting intentions, treating his courtship of Anna like a business transaction where love was optional, but money was absolutely essential. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity: convince the plainest, richest woman in America that a European title was worth any price, including financial ruin. The 1895 wedding on March 14th was a media sensation, held at the Manhattan home of Anna's brother George J. Gould I, with newspapers proclaiming headlines like, "It will cost her $160,000 to wed the imported French Count." What Anna didn't realize was that the real cost would prove infinitely more devastating than anyone imagined. The moment Bonnie gained access to Anna's $15 million fortune, he embarked on what would become one of history's most spectacular exercises in financial destruction disguised as architectural genius. The cultural clash was immediate and devastating. Anna's puritanical American upbringing collided head-on with Boney's libertine French sensibilities, creating tensions that would define their entire relationship. In 1896, just 1 year after their wedding, Bonnie purchased 2.5 acres at the corner of Avenue Foch and Avenue de Malakoff in Paris and announced his intention to build a palace that would surpass Versailles itself. The Palais Rose, as it would become known, was Boney's love letter to French royal excess, a pink marble monument to his own ego that would take 7 years to complete and cost Anna most of her inheritance. Bonnie commissioned architect Ernest Sanson to create a deliberate homage to Versailles' Grand Trianon, featuring the pink marble exterior that gave the palace its name and its owner his reputation as Europe's most expensive husband. The most spectacular feature was Bonnie's recreation of the lost Escalier des Ambassadeurs from Versailles, the legendary ambassador's staircase, where foreign dignitaries had once waited to meet Louis XIV, before it was demolished in 1752. Bonnie's perfectionism bordered on mania. He had the facade refaced twice, painted over marble when it didn't meet his exacting standards, and spent fortunes on details that only he would ever notice or appreciate. The palace included an immense ballroom, a private theatre with 500 seats, living quarters that rivaled anything at Versailles, and maintenance costs that would have bankrupted most European monarchs. But the Palais Rose was just the beginning of Boney's systematic assault on Anna's fortune. He also maintained 2 chateaux in the countryside, a villa at Deauville, and a 1,600-ton yacht named Walhalla that required a crew of 100. Bonnie's parties became legendary throughout Europe for their theatrical grandeur and eye-watering expense. For Anna's 21st birthday in 1896, he recreated the fifth day of festivities held in honour of Louis XIV's wedding to Maria Theresa of Spain. On another occasion, he hired the entire Bois de Boulogne, Paris's equivalent of Central Park, but twice the size, for a single party, because apparently regular venues were for people who couldn't afford to rent public parks. They entertained European royalty including the Queen of Naples, Queen Isabel II of Spain, and the Kings of Spain and Portugal, turning their home into an unofficial royal court, funded entirely by Anna's rapidly diminishing inheritance. Boney became known as the best-dressed man in Europe and a leading tastemaker of the Belle Époque, achievements that came with price tags Anna was only beginning to understand. Despite having access to $500,000 annually from Anna's trust fund, more than most people saw in a lifetime, Boney constantly complained about being hard up and pressured his lawyers to access more of the principal. By 1900, Anna's financial situation had become so dire that her brother George took legal guardianship, reducing Boney to a $300,000 annual allowance that sent him into aristocratic rage. Psychiatrists actually studied Boney's behaviour and coined the term co-anesthesis to describe his flamboyant excess and complete disconnection from financial reality. His spending pattern revealed a man who treated his wife's fortune as an inexhaustible resource for his aesthetic and social ambitions rather than actual money that could run out. But Boney's expensive tastes weren't limited to architecture and entertainment. His personal life was equally extravagant and infinitely more scandalous. While Boney was busy spending Anna's fortune on his Versailles fantasy, he was also conducting a parallel campaign of personal humiliation that would have destroyed a less wealthy woman's social standing entirely. Boney's sexuality was an open secret in Parisian society, where his relationships with both men and women provided endless entertainment for sophisticated circles that thrived on scandal and gossip. Marcel Proust, who was Boney's close friend, immortalized him as the character Robert de Saint-Loup in Search of Lost Time, a bisexual aristocrat who embodied the decadence and complex sexuality of the Belle Époque elite. This literary connection provided fascinating insight into how Boney's unconventional personal life was understood within the sophisticated but judgmental world of Parisian high society, where being bisexual was acceptable as long as you were discreet and stylish about it. But Boney was neither discreet nor particularly concerned about Anna's feelings, conducting his affairs with the same casual entitlement he applied to spending her money on architectural fantasies. He found it amusing to describe their bedroom as an expiatory chapel when giving tours of their home, treating their intimate life as a source of entertainment for guests who were probably already gossiping about his extramarital activities. Anna had to endure not only the financial hemorrhaging of her inheritance, but also the public humiliation of being married to a man who treated their marriage as performance art rather than a genuine relationship. During their marriage, they had 5 children together. Marie-Louise, born in 1896, who died in infancy, Boniface, born in 1897, Georges, born in 1897, and Jason, born in 1902. The scale of Boney's spending was breathtaking, even by Gilded Age standards. Over the course of their marriage, he spent approximately $10 million of Anna's inheritance, equivalent to roughly $300 million in today's currency. This represented 2/3 of her total inheritance, a staggering sum that funded not just their lifestyle, but Boney's obsessive art collecting, architectural projects, and what appeared to be a personal mission to single-handedly support the luxury goods industry of Europe. Within just 5 years of marriage, they had burned through approximately $7.7 million of her fortune, forcing Anna to live off rapidly diminishing principal rather than investment income. Anna's tolerance for her husband's excesses reached its breaking point through a series of increasingly humiliating incidents that revealed just how completely Boney had come to take her wealth for granted. The final straw came in 1906, when Anna returned home to find the electricity cut off. Boney had failed to pay the bills despite their enormous wealth, apparently because he considered utility payments beneath his aristocratic attention. This wasn't just financial irresponsibility, it was a level of contempt for basic household management that revealed how completely disconnected Boney had become from any form of practical reality. On January 20th, 1906, after 11 years of marriage and watching her inheritance evaporate, Anna finally reached her limit and filed for divorce, citing Boney's infidelity and financial recklessness. She immediately cut off Boney's access to her funds, threw him out of their homes, and sent his clothes, which were described as his only remaining fortune, to his parents, like baggage being returned after a failed vacation. The divorce proceedings revealed the full extent of the financial devastation. Boney had managed to spend nearly 70% of Anna's inheritance in just 11 years. But Anna's revenge was just beginning, and she was about to deliver a blow to Boney's aristocratic pride that would prove even more devastating than cutting off his allowance. Anna Gould's revenge against her fortune-hunting ex-husband was so diabolically perfect it could have been scripted by a vengeful novelist with an exquisite talent for poetic justice. The divorce in 1906 triggered one of the most prolonged legal battles in Catholic Church history, as Boney sought an annulment from the Vatican that would drag through 6 separate trials over 20 years. Time magazine noted in 1925 that, probably not, since Henry VIII tried in vain to get an annulment of his marriage with Catherine of Aragon, has a matrimonial case been so long in the courts of the Roman Catholic Church. While Boney battled the Vatican bureaucracy, Anna delivered the ultimate blow to his aristocratic pride in 1926 by marrying his own cousin, Élie de Talleyrand-Périgord, Duc de Sagan. This move was simultaneously brilliant and brutal. It elevated Anna from countess to duchess, while forcing Boney to watch his ex-wife claim a higher social rank within his own family circle. The Duke, son of the famous dandy Bosson de Talleyrand-Périgord, provided Anna with everything Boney had failed to deliver: a stable marriage, genuine affection, and most importantly, a husband who didn't treat her fortune like his personal shopping budget. Unlike the theatrical disaster of her first union, Anna's second marriage proved genuinely successful, lasting until the Duke's death in 1937 and producing 2 children: Howard de Talleyrand, Prince of Sagan, and Hélène Violette de Talleyrand. Tragically, Howard committed suicide in 1929, adding personal sorrow to Anna's complex later life, while Hélène carried on the family legacy. Meanwhile, Boney found himself in the unprecedented position of being a penniless French aristocrat who actually had to work for a living. A situation so unusual it practically required anthropological study. With characteristic wit and self-awareness, Boney reinvented himself as an antiques dealer and published his memoirs under the perfectly ironic title, The Art of Being Poor. His exceptional eye for art and antiques became his salvation, as he established himself as a dealer, specializing in advising American millionaires on their collections, essentially monetizing the same aesthetic sense that had bankrupted his ex-wife. Many pieces he had acquired during his affluent years with Anna eventually found their way into prestigious American museums, including the Frick Collection and the Louvre, giving his extravagant spending spree an unexpected cultural legacy. Boney also co-founded La Demeure Historique in 1924, an organisation dedicated to preserving privately owned historic buildings, ironically becoming a champion of the very conservation principles he had ignored during his marriage. But the most poignant chapter in their story involved the fate of the Palais Rose itself, the pink marble monument to their doomed marriage. The palace survived both world wars, serving various purposes including housing German commanders during the Nazi occupation and hosting the Conference of Four diplomatic meetings in 1949 and 1951. However, it couldn't survive the forces of modern development when property developer Tullio de Romedi purchased it in 1968, with plans that horrified preservation-minded Parisians. Despite public outcry and attempts by various organisations to save it, the Palais Rose was demolished in 1969 to make way for a modern apartment building, a cultural tragedy that exemplified the failure of historic preservation. Before demolition, valuable elements were salvaged, with de Romedi keeping the marble staircase for his private home, while other artworks were distributed among heirs or sold at auction. During the demolition, workers discovered closets full of period clothing, shoes, books, and letters, physical remnants of a vanished world. Anna died in 1961 at age 86, having returned to America in 1939 and eventually purchasing Lyndhurst, her father's Gothic Revival mansion, which she bequeathed to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The Anna Gould Bonny de Castellane saga remains the ultimate cautionary tale about unlimited money meeting unlimited European entitlement. Anna's journey from awkward heiress to sophisticated duchess proves that even the most painful experiences can become valuable education when you possess both unlimited resources and unlimited determination. Your worst dating disaster probably involved someone who turned out to be emotionally unavailable, financially irresponsible, or completely obsessed with their career at your expense. But during the Gilded Age, one American heiress named Mary Leiter made a relationship decision so catastrophically bad, it literally killed her before she turned 40. She essentially spent millions of dollars to buy herself a husband whose political ambitions would systematically destroy her health, happiness, and will to live over the course of 11 brutal years. Her story represents the ultimate cautionary tale about what happens when unlimited money meets unlimited male ego, proving that even the most privileged women in history remained completely vulnerable to husbands who viewed marriage as a business transaction rather than a human relationship. Therefore, in today's episode of Old Money Allure, we explore how Lord Curzon systematically destroyed the American heiress who made his career possible. Meet Mary Victoria Leiter, the ultimate Gilded Age success story who had everything money could buy, except a husband who wouldn't literally work her to death. Born on May 27, 1870, into the kind of obscene wealth that makes modern billionaires look like they're slumming it, Mary was Daddy's little princess with a $20 million trust fund. Her father, Levi Z. Leiter, had co-founded the Field and Leiter dry goods empire that became the legendary Marshall Field and Company, because apparently selling fancy fabric to rich ladies was the ultimate money-printing machine. Mary's childhood was basically a non-stop parade of Gilded Age excess. Summers lounging at their ridiculously opulent Lake Geneva mansion called Linden Lodge, complete with their own steam yacht Daisy, because walking to the lake was apparently for peasants. When little Mary turned 11, her socially ambitious mother made a power move that would change everything, packing up the entire family and relocating to Washington, D.C., where they bought the most spectacular 55-room mansion on DuPont Circle. This wasn't just showing off. This was strategic warfare in the marriage market, specifically designed to attract titled European fortune hunters who needed American cash to keep their crumbling estates afloat. Mary earned the adorable nickname Lake Geneva Princess, while being groomed for aristocratic greatness with an army of private tutors teaching her all the essential skills: dancing, singing, music, art, and French, because apparently you couldn't properly spend millions without speaking multiple languages. She became besties with the most powerful women in America, including First Lady Frances Folsom Cleveland, proving that even presidential wives needed wealthy heiress friends to make them feel important. By 1890, 20-year-old Mary was ready to conquer London society, where desperate British aristocrats were practically lining up to auction off their titles to the highest American bidder. The dollar princess craze was reaching peak insanity, with wealthy American families essentially running a sophisticated husband shopping operation across the Atlantic. At one of those glittering London balls that rich people throw to justify their existence, Mary spotted her perfect target: George Nathaniel Curzon, a 35-year-old Conservative Member of Parliament with devastating good looks, brilliant political prospects and financial problems that would make a loan shark weep. Curzon was the ideal aristocratic fixer-upper project, intellectually formidable, politically ambitious, socially connected, and completely, spectacularly broke. Mary took one look at this gorgeous disaster and made a declaration that shocked even her fearless contemporaries. "I will have him, because I believe he needs me. I have no shame." This wasn't romance. This was a young woman with unlimited resources, recognizing that she had found the perfect investment opportunity disguised as a husband. Curzon, meanwhile, was busy calculating exactly how much of Mary's fortune he'd need to resurrect his aristocratic lifestyle while maintaining the fiction that money was beneath his noble consideration. What nobody realized was that Mary was about to make the worst business deal in Gilded Age history, one that would buy her the highest political rank ever achieved by an American woman, and cost her everything else, including her life. The most expensive marriage contract in American history began with a 2-year secret engagement that should have come with giant red warning flags about Curzon's priorities. George insisted on finishing his precious political business before bothering with little details like actually talking to his fiancée, establishing the charming pattern of treating Mary like an inconvenient appointment in his schedule. After barely any contact during their engagement, because why waste time on romance when there were debts to calculate, they finally tied the knot on April 22, 1895, at St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. The ceremony was surprisingly simple, probably because the Leiter family was saving their energy for the real celebration. Writing the check that would bail out their new son-in-law's spectacular financial disasters. The Leiters immediately demonstrated their commitment to their investment by providing a jaw-dropping $200,000 dowry and paying off every single one of Curzon's crushing debts. As one brutally honest contemporary observer noted, initially Curzon had married Mary for her money in order to save his estate, but he soon fell deeply in love with her, which was Victorian speak for he learned to tolerate her after she saved him from bankruptcy. This perfectly captured the transactional reality of their union, even as everyone pretended it was a grand love story. Mary's social rocket ship reached absolutely stratospheric heights in 1898, when Curzon landed the ultimate political prize, appointment as Viceroy of India, at the ridiculously young age of 39. This promotion transformed Mary into the Vicereine of India, making her the most powerful American woman in the entire British Empire, literally second only to Queen Victoria herself in the imperial pecking order. The position placed Mary in charge of governing over 400 million people across the Indian subcontinent, which was slightly more responsibility than most 28-year-olds could handle. As vicereine, Mary had to preside over state functions so elaborate they made Versailles look like a backyard barbecue, while managing households larger than small cities and fulfilling social obligations that would have broken professional diplomats. She became absolutely legendary for her jaw-dropping appearance at the 1903 Delhi Durbar, where she wore the iconic peacock dress that became the most famous outfit in imperial history. Indian poet Ram Sharma lost his mind describing her as a rose of roses bright, a vision of embodied light, which was either genuine admiration or the most elaborate brown-nosing in literary history. Mary threw herself into the role with devastating effectiveness, becoming Curzon's secret weapon during what would become an increasingly catastrophic political tenure. She founded Lady Curzon hospitals for women's health care, supported female doctors, and her conservation advocacy helped establish what became Kaziranga National Park, because apparently saving rhinos was easier than saving her marriage. The couple produced 3 daughters during these imperial years: Mary Irene in 1896, Cynthia Blanche in 1898, and Alexandra Naldera in 1904. Political insiders credited much of Curzon's early success to Mary's grace, charm, and supernatural ability to make his increasingly unpopular policies seem almost reasonable. But the same imperial grandeur that made Mary historically significant was already systematically destroying her health, happiness, and will to live. The brutal irony was becoming clear. Mary had bought herself an empire, but the price was going to be everything that made life worth living. The imperial paradise that had elevated Mary to unprecedented heights was about to become her gilded prison, where every ceremony and state function slowly drained away another piece of her soul. India's climate was particularly brutal to European women, and Mary's delicate constitution began crumbling under the relentless assault of extreme heat, crushing humidity, and the constant pressure of performing imperial perfection 24 hours a day. But the physical torture was nothing compared to the social isolation that was slowly driving her insane, as colonial protocol turned every human interaction into a carefully choreographed performance piece. Back in London, Mary had already discovered that British society despised her for being an American upstart, while her American friends thought she was an insufferable snob for playing aristocrat. In India, the isolation became absolutely suffocating, with rigid imperial hierarchy preventing any genuine friendships, while the crushing responsibilities of ruling hundreds of millions demanded constant public appearances. The physical demands were literally killing her, as she endured multiple pregnancies while maintaining an exhausting schedule of ceremonial duties that would have challenged professional athletes. The breaking point came in the summer of 1904 when Mary suffered a near-fatal illness that was almost certainly linked to a miscarriage and subsequent infection that permanently wrecked her health. Here's where Curzon revealed his true character. Instead of staying with his dying wife, he made the spectacularly heartless decision to abandon Mary during her recovery so he could rush back to India and play politics. This abandonment during her most vulnerable moment proved that Curzon literally valued his career more than Mary's life, establishing a pattern of neglect that would prove fatal. When Mary dragged herself back to India despite being half dead, the decision was essentially suicide by imperial duty, accelerating her physical collapse beyond any hope of recovery. Everyone could see that Mary was transforming from the vibrant Lake Geneva princess into a walking ghost, losing weight dramatically and suffering from constant headaches that no amount of money could cure. Curzon's increasingly monstrous personality was making everything worse, as his political struggles intensified, and his governing style became so autocratic that even other British officials started questioning his sanity. His decision to partition Bengal in 1905 sparked massive riots and basically invented modern Indian nationalism, creating political chaos that Mary had to help manage while pretending everything was perfectly under control. Curzon's insistence on accepting a second term as viceroy, despite Mary's obvious health crisis, proved that he was either completely oblivious to human suffering or simply didn't care about anyone except himself. The final political disaster came when Curzon picked a fight with Lord Kitchener, the commander-in-chief of the Indian Army, over bureaucratic reforms that literally nobody except Curzon thought were important. This ego battle escalated into a full-scale governmental crisis that ended with Curzon being forced to resign in humiliating disgrace during the summer of 1905. Unlike normal viceroys who retired with honours and pensions, Curzon was essentially fired for being impossible to work with, making Mary's sacrifice seem even more pointless and tragic. By the time they slunk back to England in August 1905, Mary was visibly dying, and 7 years of imperial service had destroyed her so completely that recovery was impossible. The woman who had once dazzled Indian society with her grace and beauty was now a hollow shell, systematically destroyed by the very position that had made her historically significant. Curzon had gotten exactly what he wanted from their marriage: money, status, and political power, and Mary was about to pay the ultimate price for enabling his ambitions. And the final chapter of Mary Leiter Curzon's life began the moment they returned to England in August 1905, when it became obvious that 7 years of playing imperial empress had basically killed her. Mary's body was so thoroughly wrecked by tropical diseases, reproductive trauma, emotional neglect, and the sheer exhaustion of ruling an empire that even the best doctors in Europe couldn't put her back together again. The family desperately planned a 3-month vacation in the south of France, clinging to the pathetic hope that a change of scenery might magically restore the woman who had been systematically destroyed by her husband's ambitions. But Mary was already past the point of no return, her constitution so compromised by what medical records delicately described as a prolonged near-fatal infection following miscarriage, and subsequent surgical disasters, that her body was essentially running on empty. The combination of managing Curzon's political meltdowns, surviving multiple pregnancies in India's hellish climate, and enduring years of social isolation had created the perfect storm of health destruction that no amount of wealth could fix. Mary's transformation from the effervescent Lake Geneva princess into a depressed, chronically ill shadow of herself was so dramatic that even her own family barely recognized her. The emotional toll was perhaps even worse than the physical damage, as years of being abandoned by Curzon during every crisis had left her psychologically shattered and completely alone, despite being surrounded by servants and luxury. On July 18, 1906, just 2 years after losing her beloved father, and barely a year after escaping the Indian nightmare, Mary's overworked heart finally gave up the fight. She was only 36 years old, leaving behind 3 young daughters who would now have to navigate the world without the mother who had sacrificed everything for their father's political fantasies. Mary died in Curzon's arms at their London residence, finally achieving the peace that had been denied to her throughout their marriage, as her exhausted body simply stopped functioning. The official cause of death was heart failure, but everyone knew the real killer was 11 years of marriage to a man who treated his wife like a political accessory rather than a human being. Following Mary's death, Curzon went into theatrical mourning mode, commissioning an elaborate Gothic memorial chapel at Kedleston Hall that probably cost more than most people's entire estates. He hired famous sculptor Sir Bertram McKennell to create a marble effigy that would express, as might be possible in marble, the pathos of his wife's premature death, and to make the sculpture emblematic of the deepest emotion. Curzon later claimed he believed death would reunite them, which was either genuine remorse or the most elaborate guilt performance in British aristocratic history. The devastating irony of Mary's story was that her family's massive fortune, $20 million that could have bought anything in the world, proved completely worthless when it came to purchasing the one thing she desperately needed: a husband who valued her life more than his political career. Mary Leiter Curzon had achieved the impossible dream of every Gilded Age dollar princess. She had bought herself a genuine aristocratic title, imperial power beyond imagination, and a place in history. But the price turned out to be her health, her happiness, and ultimately her life, proving that even in an era when American heiresses could purchase European titles through strategic marriages, some transactions demanded payment in blood. Her premature death at 36 stands as the ultimate cautionary tale about the human cost of unchecked ambition, and the brutal reality that even the most privileged women were still completely vulnerable to the men who claimed to love them. The Chicago heiress, who had conquered the British Empire, had ultimately been conquered by a system that viewed wives as political assets rather than human beings, leaving behind only a marble tomb and 3 motherless daughters as proof that wealth without wisdom leads to tragedy. Mary Leiter Curzon proved that money could buy aristocratic titles, imperial power, and a place in history, but not happiness or longevity. Her premature death at 36 serves as the ultimate cautionary tale about the cost of marrying for status rather than love. Despite ruling over 400 million people as Viceroy of India, she couldn't save herself from a husband who treated her like a political investment. Behind every Gilded Age fortune lies a story of ambition, risk, and strategic brilliance. But Helena Zimmermann's inheritance came with an unexpected price. It made her irresistible to the kind of aristocratic criminals who viewed wealthy American heiresses as walking bank accounts, You see, her father Eugene had built his millions through genuine heroism and business genius, surviving Confederate torpedoes during the Civil War, before parlaying military experience into oil and railroad empires that made him one of America's wealthiest men. And though this extraordinary background should have opened every door and guaranteed Helena's happiness, it instead attracted a predator whose financial desperation masked itself behind an impressive title and aristocratic charm. The Duke who pursued her had already attempted to deceive multiple wealthy families and was notorious throughout both British and American society as a shameless fortune hunter whose spending matched his inability to pay bills. Thus, in today's episode of Old Money Allure, we examine Helena Zimmerman's journey from victim to survivor and the lessons her story teaches about recognizing predatory behavior. Imagine having a father so wealthy he could buy entire railroad systems, so heroic he survived being blown into a river by Confederate torpedoes, and so business-savvy he sold oil to John D. Rockefeller at exactly the right moment, and then using all that privilege to marry a man who couldn't afford to pay for fake jewelry. Helena Zimmerman was born on September 25, 1878, into American industrial royalty that made the robber barons look like small-time operators. Yet she would spend 32 years married to a criminal who systematically destroyed every dollar her father had earned. Her father, Eugene Zimmerman, had built one of the most spectacular fortunes of the Gilded Age through a combination of military heroism, perfect timing, and the kind of business instincts that turned Civil War naval officers into oil and railroad magnates. Eugene's path to wealth had begun with distinguished military service that reads like an adventure novel. Initially refused by the Union Navy for being too young, he persisted until he was accepted as a master's mate in the Mississippi River Squadron. His ship was struck by a torpedo during combat, killing several seamen and throwing young Eugene into the Yazoo River, where he survived what should have been certain death. He went on to participate in crucial battles including the Battle of St. Charles and Duval's Bluffs, earning promotion to ensign for his courage under fire. During the Vicksburg campaign, fought in his hometown, Eugene commanded a mortarboat and made a successful run against the Confederate blockade, demonstrating the bold risk-taking that would later serve him in business. He left naval service as a 20-year-old lieutenant with invaluable experience in leadership, strategic thinking, and crisis management that would prove essential in his civilian career. After the war, Eugene demonstrated the same strategic vision that had served him in combat by investing wisely in oil properties during the early days of the petroleum industry. His timing was absolutely impeccable. He sold his extensive oil holdings to John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company in 1874, receiving not just cash, but valuable shares and a seat on the board. This transaction positioned Eugene at the center of what would become one of the world's most powerful corporations, providing him with the capital to diversify into railroads. He systematically built a railroad empire, becoming president of the Cincinnati, Hamilton and Dayton Railroad, and eventually controlling numerous other lines throughout the Midwest and South. By 1900, Eugene was worth an estimated $10 million, equivalent to approximately $280 million today, making him one of America's wealthiest men. But tragedy had struck the Zimmerman family early when Helena's mother, Marietta Evans Zimmerman, died of peritonitis in 1882 when Helena was only 4 years old. This early loss shaped Helena's childhood and influenced Eugene's decision to send his only child to France for her education, where she would receive the kind of cosmopolitan training that would prepare her for life among the international elite. During her many years in France, Helena became accomplished in horsemanship and fencing, skills that marked her as someone with exceptional training and access to the finest instructors. She also became an expert swimmer, demonstrating athletic abilities that were still relatively rare among young women of her social class. By 1900, Helena had completed her transformation from a Cincinnati Railroad heiress into an internationally educated young woman described as a handsome blonde and a belle. She was ready to take her place in society, completely unaware that she was about to meet a man whose financial desperation would make her father's millions irresistible and her own happiness utterly expendable. What Helena didn't know was that among the costumed revellers at a Dinard ball in 1900 lurked a bankrupt duke who had already tried to trick another heiress into marriage and was now sizing up his next victim. The 23-year-old man who would destroy Helena's life was William Angus Drogo Montagu, the 9th Duke of Manchester. A title that sounded impressive, but concealed a family tradition of spectacular financial mismanagement spanning multiple generations. The Duke was already notorious in both British and American society as one of his generation's most shameless fortune hunters, having inherited his title at age 15 and spent 8 years perfecting the art of aristocratic bankruptcy. His ancestors had systematically decimated the family fortune through extravagant entertaining for the Prince of Wales, while the 8th Duke had married Cuban-American heiress Consuelo Iznaga without securing the expected dowry. When the 9th Duke inherited at 15, he allegedly went down on his knees to the Prince of Wales to beg forgiveness for his mother, an early experience of grovelling that shaped his entire approach to survival. The Duke's pursuit of Helena was part of a calculated campaign to restore his family's finances through marriage to a wealthy American heiress, conducted like a business strategy rather than a romantic quest. His methods were both desperate and deceptive. In 1897, he had unilaterally announced his engagement to the wealthy Maygole, much to her surprise and dismay. Maygole's father, Ogden, was so outraged by the Duke's presumption that he declared he would rather see my daughter dead than Duchess of Manchester, a reaction that should have served as a warning to other wealthy fathers. The Duke's reputation had become so notorious that newspapers would later publish photographs of him, surrounded by portraits of the 22 women he was supposed to have been engaged to. Eugene Zimmerman's opposition to the match demonstrated the same business acumen that had made him successful in oil and railroads. He recognized that the Duke was nearly bankrupt and must have seemed aimless as he drifted from acting to reporting to chasing heiresses. Eugene insisted that the couple wait, and Helena returned home to Cincinnati, a strategic move designed to break up the relationship and give his daughter time to see the Duke's true character. However, Helena returned to England in November 1900 with a chaperone but without her father, and the chaperone was easily won over by the Duke's charm and desperation. On November 14, 1900, the couple were married privately at Marylebone Church in London, in a ceremony so secret that neither Helena's father nor the Duke's mother was present. The secrecy was indicative of the marriage's questionable nature. The Duke's mother didn't believe the reports until she verified them through the church's marriage register, while both families found out through newspaper reports. Almost immediately after their marriage, the Duke's financial recklessness became spectacularly apparent in the most humiliating way possible. In December 1900, just weeks after their wedding, he purchased 3 imitation pearl necklaces from Frederick & Company jewelers on Broadway in New York for $695 as a wedding gift for his new bride. However, true to his character, he failed to pay for them, creating a scandal that would symbolize their entire marriage. Less than a year later, in 1901, Frederick & Co. sued the Duke for non-payment, with the Evening Express reporting the lawsuit under the headline, "Imitation Jewellery, the Duke of Manchester Sued." This was particularly humiliating because the Duke could afford neither genuine pearls nor apparently fake ones. A perfect metaphor for a marriage built on deception. The fake pearls became symbolic of everything wrong with their union. They appeared valuable, but were worthless imitations, just like the Duke himself, who presented himself as a worthy husband, but was actually a bankrupt fortune hunter. Helena was photographed wearing pearls on several occasions, but it remained unclear whether these were the notorious Frederick necklaces or other pieces, adding mystery to the mounting evidence of her husband's duplicity. Within months of their wedding, Helena would discover that a man who couldn't pay for fake jewellery had far grander and more destructive financial ambitions in mind. Helena's father Eugene had wisely structured his daughter's inheritance through trusts to prevent the Duke from accessing the entire fortune directly, but this legal protection proved inadequate against a man determined to spend his way through millions. Despite the safeguards, the Duke systematically depleted Helena's resources while Eugene continued supporting their lavish lifestyle, including buying the couple Kylemore Castle in Ireland as a wedding gift in 1903. The Duke's entertaining at Kylemore was legendary and ruinously expensive. One famous weekend in 1903 saw the Duke and Duchess of Connaught and their entourage bag over 1,000 pheasants in a display of aristocratic excess that would have impressed Versailles. By 1908, just 5 years after receiving it as a gift, the Duke was forced to sell his Irish estates because his spending had become completely unsustainable. Kylemore Castle was mortgaged during World War I to pay debts and eventually sold in the 1920s, while the family's ancestral seat, Kimbolton Castle, also faced financial pressure from the Duke's uncontrolled spending. In 1915, the Duke was declared bankrupt, a public humiliation that exposed the full extent of his financial irresponsibility and criminal mismanagement of Helena's wealth. His spending and debts were so excessive that he spent much of his life abroad, evading creditors and attempting to extract money from wealthy acquaintances through increasingly desperate schemes. Throughout these 3 decades, Helena endured serial infidelity and public humiliation as the Duke's notorious womanizing was conducted openly and documented in society columns. The marriage that had begun with deception, fake pearl necklaces unpaid for by her new husband, continued in the same vein with constant lies and betrayals that destroyed her emotional well-being. Helena's wealth, which should have provided security and independence, instead became a trap that funded her husband's destructive lifestyle while leaving her psychologically and financially devastated. The couple had 4 children together, which likely made Helena reluctant to leave, despite the obvious problems in their marriage and the Duke's increasingly erratic behaviour. The situation reached its nadir in 1935, when the Duke was sentenced to 9 months in HM Prison Wormwood Scrubs for false pretences, having made false statements to a pawnbroker to obtain cash. This imprisonment occurred just 4 years after his divorce from Helena, demonstrating that his criminal behaviour had likely been ongoing throughout their marriage, making her an unwitting accomplice to financial fraud. The Duke's criminal conviction revealed the true extent of his character. He was not merely a spendthrift aristocrat, but an actual criminal who had systematically defrauded creditors and financial institutions. Helena had endured over 3 decades of financial and emotional abuse at the hands of a man who had married her purely for her money, and then systematically destroyed her wealth and happiness. By the time of their divorce in December 1931, the Duke had squandered both his and her fortune, leaving Helena financially depleted after 31 years of marriage to a criminal. The divorce was granted on the grounds of the Duke's serial infidelity and reckless spending, though the legal language hardly captured the full scope of the devastation he had wreaked on her life. The Duke remarried almost immediately after the divorce, wedding stage actress Kathleen Dawes on December 17, 1931, demonstrating his lack of genuine feeling for Helena and his primary interest in financial gain. The Duke's immediate remarriage to a stage actress proved Helena had been right to finally escape. But at 53, she was about to shock society by proving that second chances could lead to genuine happiness. After 31 years married to a man who had systematically destroyed her inheritance while conducting affairs and eventually serving prison time, Helena escaped through divorce in December 1931. At age 53, she might have retreated from society to live quietly on whatever remained of her father's fortune. But she had inherited Eugene Zimmerman's resilience, along with his money. In 1937, at age 59, Helena married Arthur George Keith Falconer, the 10th Earl of Kintore, in a ceremony that represented everything her first marriage had not: genuine affection, mutual respect and honourable character. The Earl of Kintore was described as educated at Eton and a career military officer who had served with distinction in the Boer War and World War I. A man with an honourable record of service rather than a criminal record. Unlike her first husband, who had married her purely for financial gain, the Earl of Kintore was not a fortune hunter, but a respectable Scottish nobleman with his own ancestral properties and military pension. The wedding took place in Edinburgh, Scotland, on November 23, 1937, marking the beginning of what would prove to be a genuinely happy marriage based on companionship and mutual affection. Helena exchanged her 3 country houses from her disastrous first marriage for her second husband's ancestral seat in northern Scotland, Keith Hall, where she would spend the happiest years of her life. As the Countess of Kintore, Helena finally experienced the kind of marriage she should have had from the beginning, one based on love and respect rather than financial exploitation and criminal behaviour. The contrast between her 2 marriages could not have been more stark. Her first husband had been a bankrupt fortune hunter who couldn't pay for fake pearls and ended up in prison, while her second was an honourable military officer who provided genuine companionship. Helena lived at Keith Hall for 34 years, far longer than her 31-year nightmare with the Duke of Manchester, proving that it's never too late to find happiness after decades of abuse and exploitation. She died on December 15, 1971, at Keith Hall in Inverurie, Scotland, at the remarkable age of 93, having lived for 40 years after finally escaping her first marriage. Her longevity suggests that freedom from the Duke's toxic influence allowed her to flourish physically and emotionally in ways that had been impossible during their marriage. Helena's story serves as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of marrying for social status rather than character, and an inspiring example of resilience and redemption. The fake pearls that the Duke couldn't afford to pay for in 1901 had become the perfect metaphor for their entire marriage. Apparently valuable, but actually worthless, just like the Duke himself. Helena Zimmermann's transformation from victim to survivor demonstrates that even after decades of financial and emotional abuse, it's possible to rebuild a life and find genuine happiness. The railroad princess, who had been systematically bankrupted by a criminal duke, ultimately found peace and contentment in the Scottish Highlands, proving that character matters more than titles and genuine love is worth more than fake pearls. Her father Eugene's Civil War heroism had built the fortune that attracted the Duke's predatory attention, but Helena's own courage in finally leaving him demonstrated that she had inherited his strength along with his wealth. The woman who had endured 32 years of exploitation by a man who couldn't pay for costume jewellery spent her final decades in the happiness that had always been her birthright, surrounded by genuine affection rather than fake promises. Prenuptial negotiations usually involve lawyers, witnesses, and carefully worded contracts. Alice Thor discovered that some negotiations happen with 5,000 spectators watching and a bride trapped in silk and desperation. In the spring of 1903, when American railroad fortunes still bore the soot of their origins and British titles carried the weight of crumbling estates, a perfect storm of greed and desperation converged on a single altar. What began as a fairy tale collision between New World wealth and Old World nobility would evolve into something far more sinister, a hostage situation disguised as holy matrimony, where family honour became ransom and a wedding march transformed into a death march for illusion itself. The coal dust of Pittsburgh was about to meet the stage powder of a performer whose greatest role was convincing an heiress that love could be purchased with a title. Thus, in today's episode of Old Money Allure, we delve into the most audacious matrimonial extortion scheme in American history. Alice Cornelia Thor commanded a fortune that could buy entire Pennsylvania coal towns, $13 million by most estimates, making her one of the wealthiest unmarried women in America at 23 years old. Her father, William Thor Sr., had conquered railroads and coal fields with the same ruthless efficiency, leaving his children drowning in more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. Into this gilded Pittsburgh paradise slithered George Francis Alexander Seymour, Earl of Yarmouth, carrying a title that traced back centuries and debts that traced back to last Tuesday. The Earl had already declared bankruptcy in 1899, a spectacular feat for someone whose father commanded one of Britain's great estates at Ragley Hall. His annual allowance of £200 barely covered his champagne tastes, let alone the £3,000 he owed to increasingly impatient creditors. But George possessed something more valuable than money: aristocratic charm, polished by desperation, and a talent for reinvention. He'd been touring American vaudeville stages under the preposterous stage name Eric Hope, passing himself off as a matinee idol to paying audiences. Between performances, he'd tried his hand at banana farming in Queensland, where he'd been sued for underpaying labourers before creditors seized his entire tropical crop. The Earl specialised in hunting American money, having already courted 4 other heiresses, including one of Alice's own cousins, before setting his sights on the Thor fortune. His approach followed 5 calculated steps: change your name, crash the right parlour, borrow props, play the sympathy card, then press fast forward before anyone could investigate properly. Alice met him at her brother Josiah's townhouse on Lafayette Square, opposite the Belasco Theatre in January 1903, where he'd arrived as Harry's guest. The Earl told reporters his bankruptcy stemmed from reckless generosity to poor friends, while asking those same journalists to spot him lunch money. His mother reportedly had to lend him evening clothes for Washington parties, his own wardrobe having been seized by less patient creditors. The engagement announcement in February 1903 sent Pittsburgh society into delighted convulsions over their coal princess becoming a countess. Mary Sibbett Thor, Alice's formidable mother, orchestrated wedding preparations with military precision for April 27th at Calvary Episcopal Church. Society columnists breathlessly detailed Alice's $100,000 trousseau, $3.3 million in today's money, while delicately ignoring the groom's temporary financial embarrassments. The 3-month courtship moved at breakneck speed, perhaps deliberately orchestrated to prevent any thorough investigation into the Earl's spectacular financial failures. Alice's wealth included $200,000 in cash, plus 11,000 shares of Pennsylvania Railroad stock, making her an irresistible target. The Earl scrambled to maintain his aristocratic facade while dodging New York creditors who had gotten wind of his impending windfall. "I don't owe much here and I don't want any fuss," he assured reporters, adding that his lawyer would meet anybody who may have a claim against me. As April 27th approached, 5,000 curiosity seekers prepared to descend on Calvary Church, with hundreds planning to climb telephone poles for a better view. Pittsburgh bookmakers offered 8-to-1 odds that the marriage would end within 5 years. Prescient Gap would collect their winnings in 1908. But first, the Earl had one more performance to give, one that would transform the Blessed Sacrament into the most audacious shakedown in matrimonial history. Calvary Episcopal Church overflowed with 5,000 gaping spectators on April 27, 1903, as police struggled to clear paths through the crushing mob. Inside, Pittsburgh's elite sat in their finest silks and diamonds, waiting to witness their coal heiress ascend to British nobility beneath $50,000 worth of white orchids. The orchestra had taken their positions. Alice waited in the vestry, resplendent in her Paris gown, and society matrons adjusted their lorgnettes for the perfect view. Then came the footman with a message that would transform a fairy tale wedding into an extortion plot worthy of a penny dreadful. The Earl of Yarmouth refused to enter the church unless Mary Sibbett Thor immediately transferred $1 million in Pittsburgh plate glass stock and copper mining certificates directly to his name. No trust arrangements, no marriage settlements, no protective clauses, just cold, hard securities worth $35.5 million in today's dollars. The ultimatum exploded in the vestry like one of Andrew Carnegie's blast furnaces, leaving Alice frozen in her wedding finery while her mother confronted aristocratic blackmail. Outside, the restless mob sensed catastrophe, climbing higher on telephone poles and pressing closer to church doors as minutes ticked by without a processional. The bridegroom sat supremely confident in his carriage, calculating that the Thors would capitulate rather than face the social apocalypse of a cancelled wedding. Harry Thor, serving as best man, later claimed that had he known of the extortion, we would have kicked the Earl downstairs rather than let him near the altar. But Harry stood ignorant inside while lawyers huddled with Mrs. Thor, who finally, furiously, signed papers transferring what financial historians calculate as the largest same-day wealth movement by any private American woman before 1914. Only then did George Francis Alexander Seymour, Earl of Yarmouth, deign to enter the church and claim his purchased bride. The rector would record it as the most disorderly congregation seen to date in parish minutes, though whether he meant the mob or the barely suppressed scandal remained diplomatically unclear. Alice spoke her vows in a voice observers described as faint, the first sign that her $1 million marriage might not be worth its price. The ceremony concluded with police escorts clearing paths through the crowd as the newlyweds fled to their carriage amid a storm of rice and speculation. "I don't expect any trouble with creditors, as my lawyer is here," the Earl breezily told reporters before boarding the Saint, Paul for England. He'd transformed the holy sacrament of marriage into a hostage negotiation, holding the Thor family reputation at gunpoint for a king's ransom. Society columnists struggled to describe the wedding without acknowledging the $1 million elephant in the room, focusing instead on bridesmaids' gowns and floral arrangements. But whispers spread faster than telegraph wires about the groom who demanded payment at the church door like some medieval robber baron. The new Countess of Yarmouth sailed toward England carrying more than her trousseau. She bore the distinction of being the most expensive bride in American history. But as their ship crossed the Atlantic, Alice remained blissfully unaware that her husband's previous theatrical career, the one he'd so carefully concealed during their whirlwind courtship, involved performances that would shock even the worldly matrons of Pittsburgh society and explain why their marriage would remain as empty as his bankrupt estate. Ragley Hall's servants whispered that the bridal suite sheets remained pristine, virgin linen for a virgin countess whose husband had other interests entirely. Before his bankruptcy and bride-hunting days, George had conquered colonial stages as Mademoiselle Rose, twirling through Loie Fuller's patented serpentine dance in 200 yards of silk. Brisbane critics declared it the most remarkable theatrical entertainment ever seen in the Southern Hemisphere, while Hobart audiences gasped at his butterfly wings. The Earl's drag costumes travelled in a monogrammed Louis Vuitton trunk marked GFAS, accompanied by wigs, corsets and theatrical makeup, more luggage than his new wife's possessions. Fuller later cited the Earl in her landmark 1892 copyright lawsuit on choreographic ownership, making him an unwitting test case in American dance law. At Ragley, Alice fought her own battles, declaring English cuisine fit only for hounds and importing crates of Heinz pickles and Hershey bars to Warwickshire. The Earl funded his aesthetic pursuits with Thor money, while restricting his wife to a household allowance that would cease if the marriage was nullified. He'd grown furious discovering the fortune remained largely in American trusts, accessible only through carefully controlled monthly payments rather than the wholesale plunder he'd envisioned. Within months, reports of the Earl's ill treatment reached Mary Sibbett Thor in Pittsburgh, though newspapers demurred from specifying his exact offences. Meanwhile, Alice's brother Harry provided his own spectacular scandal in 1906, shooting architect Stanford White at Madison Square Garden. The murder stemmed from White's predatory relationship with Harry's wife, Evelyn Nesbit, the famous model known as the Girl on the Velvet Swing. Harry's trial of the century exposed the decadent underbelly of New York society, while his sister endured her own private degradation in England. Found not guilty by reason of insanity, Harry entered Matawan Asylum, while Alice secretly lobbied Consuelo Vanderbilt, Duchess of Marlborough, to support prison reform visits on his behalf. The Thor family scandals piled upon each other: a murdered architect, an insane brother, and a countess trapped in an unconsummated marriage to a cross-dressing earl. By 1907, Alice had endured enough and filed for annulment, alleging permanent incapacity and non-consummation of the marriage. The petition required 2 court-appointed doctors to examine both parties, a medical investigation promising to reveal exactly why those sheets stayed pristine. British society reeled at the prospect of such intimate details becoming public record in what promised to be the most sensational annulment trial in memory. The Earl countersued, demanding £5,000 annually from Alice's trust. A claim so audacious, the judge reportedly laughed it out of court. He'd extorted $1 million at the altar, treated her fortune as his personal aesthetic fund, and now demanded payment for the privilege of leaving her untouched. August 1908 would bring the trial that stripped away the last pretenses of their Gilded Age fairy tale. 2 doctors would testify, financial records would be exposed, and the true nature of the Earl's permanent incapacity would shock even jaded society observers. The girl from Pittsburgh who'd wanted a title would finally learn the full price of her aristocratic ambitions and discover whether American millions could buy her freedom from British nobility. August 1908 brought deliverance when British courts granted Alice's annulment, declaring the marriage void and returning every penny of her extorted securities, which wartime appreciation had grown to $1.4 million. The medical testimony confirmed the Earl's permanent incapacity, while financial records exposed his attempts to siphon her fortune for theatrical costumes and gambling debts. Alice immediately resumed her maiden name and sailed for America, leaving the Earl to face court costs and the distinction of perpetrating history's most expensive case of marital fraud. She settled in Lenox, Massachusetts, transforming herself from Pittsburgh princess to pioneering horticulturist, planting cedars of Lebanon that still shade Woods Hole's Church Street. In Washington, she purchased 1801 F Street Northwest, installing the East Coast's first residential climate-controlled rose conservatory with retractable glass designed by Jules de Cibourg. Her salon became pre-war Washington's premier gathering spot, where she hosted clandestine suffrage planning sessions using the code word botany lecture to evade hostile reporters. Visitors marvelled at her Thomas Johnson Rococo mirror imported from London, a subtle revenge on British taste from a woman who'd imported Hershey bars to Ragley Hall. On March 22, 1913, she married Boston stockbroker Geoffrey Whitney on Cumberland Island, Georgia. 20 guests, 0 extortion, and plenty of fried oysters. The ceremony specified no gifts, Alice having learned that simplicity beat spectacle when it came to matrimonial ventures. Meanwhile, the Earl's trajectory traced a perfect arc of aristocratic dissolution, beginning with bankruptcy number 2 in 1911, debts of £23,000 against assets of worthless racing IOUs. His father's death in 1912 brought the Marquess of Hertford but only a life interest, the family having wisely locked away anything he might pawn. By 1927, he was selling the family Titian for £60,000 to cover Monte Carlo markers, the last masterpiece not nailed down by trustees. The man who'd performed as Mademoiselle Rose in Australian music halls died alone in a Torquay hotel in 1940, his estate valued at £37. His descendant William Seymour would fight his own parents in a 2025 High Court battle for control of the £85 million Ragley estate, the judge citing secretly recorded ammunition as evidence of continuing family dysfunction. Alice thrived in her second act, earning the Massachusetts Horticultural Society's Medal of Achievement in 1939 for her botanical contributions. She supported her institutionalized brother Harry from afar, while her sister Margaret married Andrew Carnegie's nephew, then a French count, starring in risqué Parisian tableaux vivants. Financial historians still cite Mary Thor's forced wedding day transfer as the largest same-day private wealth movement by an American woman before 1914. The Earl entered drag history as the first titled British performer to headline in women's clothes for pay, while Alice inspired the Dollar Princess narrative from Edith Wharton to HBO. Those Pittsburgh bookmakers, who'd offered 8-to-1 odds against the marriage lasting 5 years, had called it perfectly, collecting their winnings in 1908. The coal heiress who'd paid $1 million for a countess's coronet discovered that freedom was the only title worth having, and that the best revenge against a theatrical earl was a life lived genuinely, without costume or pretense, in American soil where her trees would outlast his name. Alice Thor's fairy tale wedding to the Earl of Yarmouth turned into the most expensive extortion scheme in matrimonial history when he refused to enter the church unless her family immediately transferred $1 million to his name. The bankrupt Earl, who had performed in drag as Mademoiselle Rose, left their marriage unconsummated, leading to an annulment that freed Alice to reclaim her fortune and build a genuinely successful life as a pioneering horticulturist.